Week 15, it's money time in fantasy football. So you need to know which players are in position to succeed and which ones might fail. So I'm going to give you high-value stats from every Week 15 game to help you make the decisions you need to crush in Week 15. We'll go in order of the games, starting with Niners-Seahawks on Thursday Night Football. The Niners have let Brock Purdy loose with the deep ball a little more than would be expected, but this could be a spot against Seattle where they target short and easy throws. The Seahawks' .17 estimated points added on throws under 20 yards is one of the softest marks in the league. They allow a 72% completion rate on these throws and 7.5 yards per pass attempt. With no Deebo Samuel, things could concentrate heavily for Christian McCaffrey. On the other side, it's a brutal spot for Geno Smith in Seattle versus a Niners defense with a negative 19% defensive DVOA and a negative .104 estimated points added per play. San Francisco runs zone defense on a high 58% of plays, which could be bad news for DK Metcalf. He has a team high 37.5% targets per route run versus man. But Tyler Lockett is targeted more versus zone defenses with 2.2 yards per route run compared to 1.6 for Metcalf. Saturday is 3 games this week, so you're going to need to decide on these guys early. And it could be a good day for the Colts offense versus Minnesota. Minnesota forces 3 and outs at a bottom of the league 14% rate. They give up a 48% success rate on dropbacks. With Minnesota also generating pressure at a low 19% rate, this could be an ideal situation for Matt Ryan and a Colts offense that falls apart when Ryan is under duress. Jonathan Taylor can get there on volume, but Michael Pittman might be in the best spot against the Vikings defense that's 26th versus wide receiver ones. Justin Jefferson is going to be crucial on that Saturday DraftKings slate as well as for everybody else who has him in fantasy. And he could smash this week. Indianapolis is 27th in the league versus wide receiver ones with a 20% DVOA boost to the position. And they're 28th versus tight ends as well. Kirk Cousins double stacks with Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson could explode if the Colts do their job on offense. People are quick to point out J.K. Dobbins hobbling on big plays versus Pittsburgh, but he could probably crawl his way to big rushing yardage versus Cleveland. The .085 EPA that Cleveland allows on rushing plays is the worst mark in the league. Their 10% rushing DVOA boost, according to Football Outsiders, is also bottom of the barrel. Dobbins or Gus Edwards, or maybe both, could feast no matter who's at QB for the Ravens. Deshaun Watson showed some signs of improvement versus a tough Cincinnati D. Now he faces a Baltimore team that's quietly awful at defending downfield passes. Baltimore gives up a high 62% completion rate on throws to 20-plus yards and a high 1.1 EPA on those plays. With Watson targeting Donovan Peoples-Jones heavily so far and Amari Cooper nursing an injured hip, it's much more likely they get going than the Browns' backfield versus the low 38% success rate that Baltimore allows versus the run. This is one of the lowest totals of the year for Miami with just 17.3 implied points from Vegas. And there are no more obvious weaknesses to target going against Buffalo with Tre'Davious White up to a 100% snap share last week. On the year, the Bills are 29th versus wide receiver ones according to DVOA, but that's down from 32nd rank before White returned. Buffalo's also stellar versus the run with a negative .132 EPA versus rushers. Miami's an interesting contrarian play with how much they love to throw, but it's hard to fall in love with this spot. Buffalo should force them to throw with a Miami defense that's middling across the board. Miami gives up a 48% success rate on dropbacks and teams score 60% of the time they get into the Dolphins' red zone. The Dolphins also run man defense at a noteworthy 28% of plays. And Stephon Diggs, he crushes man D with 33% targets per route run and 2.9 yards per route. Diggs is an interesting pivot from or addition to Justin Jefferson on that DraftKings Saturday slate. Now on to Sunday's games. Dallas at Jacksonville is a much more interesting game than you would have thought earlier in the year, but Dallas should feast on offense. Jacksonville gives up a 24% DVOA boost to opposing passers. It is 22nd versus wide receiver ones and worst in the league at defending tight ends with a 39% boost to the position. Even if Tony Pollard doesn't break his usual big plays, Dallas will score against the Jags D that gives up a touchdown on 26% of drives. Jacksonville's offense has shown upside lately, but Dallas's defense may put a stop to that. They get pressure on a league-high 28% of dropbacks and are one of the best in the league with a minus .103 EPA per play. It's hard to see the Jags' recent good run continuing in a much tougher matchup than they saw last week versus Tennessee. Desmond Ridder will make his debut for Atlanta, and this is a good spot to do it. The Saints have been 28th in the league with a 20% DVOA boost to wide receiver ones, and they force QB hurries at a league-low 4.6% rate. Ridder should have a lot of mobility with a 97th percentile 4.5 40-yard dash, and it's possible he feeds Drake London with the Saints running man defense on 40% of dropbacks. In London, he's targeted 37% of the time when running a route against man D. New Orleans also should find ways to be able to score against the Falcons. Atlanta's 49% success rate allowed on all plays is one of the highest marks in the league. They also give up 5 adjusted line yards per play, which reflects the amount of push that opposing rushing offenses get against them. With Alvin Kamara recently losing work to Mark Ingram, but Mark Ingram expected out for this game. This could be a ceiling matchup for Kamara that pays off all his disappointments all season long. It could be Mitch Trubisky or Mason Rudolph starting at Carolina with Kenny Pickett in the concussion protocol. But it could be a bad scene for either QB, especially with how Trubisky's been forcing the ball downfield. Mitch Trubisky attempts 5 throws of 20-plus air yards per game. In Carolina, they have a league-best 9.3% interception rate against deep pass attempts, along with a brutally low 30% completion rate that gobbled up a much better passer in Geno Smith last week. It's a similarly meh matchup on Carolina's side. Pittsburgh plays man at a high 39% rate, which has been good for DJ Moore, who's targeted 34% of his routes against man D, and he has an 18% touchdown rate on those plays. Moore has been banged up with an ankle issue, but could be an interesting contrarian play if he makes it in, if he's good to go after disappointing with 0 catches in Week 14. Kansas City's 31.8 implied total is the highest of the week at Houston. And while people may target Chiefs running backs with the perception that Houston is particularly bad versus the run, it's possible that Patrick Mahomes runs up the score through the air. The Chiefs' pass rate over expectation is the highest in the league at 11%, and they pass even more in the red zone, 14% over expectation. The Chiefs won't need Travis Kelce to score, but he and Juju Smith-Schuster, they're live for ceiling games if they just get fed. Houston is a dumpster fire of a team, but there is opportunity depending upon who's active. Right now, I'm most intrigued by Dare Ogunbowale with Dameon Pierce out for a high ankle sprain. Kansas City gives up a good 0.2 EPA on throws under 20 air yards, and Ogunbowale averages 1.7 targets per game on his low 7.1 snaps per game. If that number increases at a similar weight, Ogunbowale could have a big PPR upside even if he doesn't make it into the end zone. Dameon Pierce has generated 30% of the Texans' total yards in 2022, as well as 25% of their touchdowns. Detroit faces the Jets in a game that feels like a nightmare for a surging Jared Goff, but it could be an interesting contrarian spot to target Amon-Ra St. Brown after he busted his chalk last week. The Jets' strength is defending deep balls, a league-best negative 0.52 EPA on throws of 20-plus yards, but they give up a solid 70% completion rate on throws under 20 yards. With Amon-Ra, a PPR monster who sees just 6.2 air yards per target, he could rack up dink and dunk receptions that nobody will play due to the perceived tough matchup. The Jets on their side are in a fantastic offensive spot versus Detroit. Detroit's 0.111 EPA per play allowed is one of the worst marks in the league, and they forced 3 and outs at a bottom of the barrel 15% rate. With Zonovan Knight earning 18.7 intended touches per game, he could be a literal league winner against the Lions team that gives up touchdowns on 30.5% of drives and 65% of opponent red zone visits. Philadelphia should take Chicago to the woodshed despite the road game. Chicago's 21% DVOA boost allowed is one of the worst marks in the league, and it's even worse versus the pass with a 28% DVOA boost to opposing passing offenses, as well as 0.215 EPA per dropback. Miles Sanders won't be surprised after 2 games over 31 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks. But this could be another one where he racks up touchdowns and coasts with his team's success, no matter how Chicago plays. And Chicago's in for a tough time against the Philly defense that's getting healthier by the week. The rushing EPA is back down to 0 after being a weak spot without Jordan Davis. And Philly is number 1 in the league versus wide receiver 1s and number 3 versus wide receiver 2s, according to DVOA. Justin Fields can run the Bears into competitiveness, but it's hard to imagine Chicago having the horses to compete against the NFC's top team. Arizona will be without Kyler Murray after he tore his ACL on Monday Night Football, and there's nothing to like with just 16.5 implied points against a staunch Denver defense. Denver's negative 17% DVOA versus passers is one of the best marks in the league. Same for their low, negative 0.106 EPA per play overall. Maybe James Conner or DeAndre Hopkins can get there due to their talent, but it's hard to imagine ceiling days with Colt McCoy at QB and their lowest implied total of the season. As for Denver, they fail in every situation, but this is a nice matchup for them no matter who is at QB. Arizona's 52% success rate allowed on dropbacks is one of the worst marks in the league, and they also miss tackles at a high 9% rate. Cortland Sutton can't go. You might be able to trust Jerry Jeudy with that target concentration, or hope Greg Dulcich gets going with Arizona 30th versus tight ends with a 34% DVOA boost to the position. I still wouldn't play Russell Wilson or Brett Rippon, but both guys can mediocre their way to good days for their pass catchers. Monitoring Ramondre Stevenson's status for the week is crucial after he hurt his ankle on Monday night, but it could be an interesting situation for Mac Jones if Ramondre goes or not. Las Vegas gives up a bottom of the league 28% DVOA boost to opposing passers, while they have a negative 4% rushing DVOA and minus 0.131 EPA on run plays. For Mondre can't go, you could see a ceiling day for Jacoby Myers, Nelson Aguilar, whoever the Patriots trot out there at receiver. On the other side, it's a tough situation on paper for the Raiders offense against New England. Pat's negative 0.108 EPA per play is the stingiest mark in the league, and they're top 12 in DVOA against wide receiver ones, wide receiver threes, and tight ends. But Devontae Adams is an interesting play with Josh McDaniels' knowledge of the Patriots defense, particularly when similar knowledge allowed former Pats QB Kevin O'Connell to scheme up a 9 for 139 day for Justin Jefferson on Thanksgiving. But it'd be hard to trust anything for the Raiders at high volume, with the Pats D quietly one of the most shut down teams in the league. Derrick Henry is going to be one of the most popular plays of the week at the Chargers. It's hard to argue with a 0.03 rushing EPA allowed by LA and 4.8 adjusted line yards allowed per rush. And there's a faint risk that Henry could get game planned out if LA attacks Tennessee downfield like a lot of teams have recently. But Henry, he's likely to be one of the safest plays of the week. As I mentioned, teams have really started to exploit Tennessee's downfield defense, which allows a high 18% touchdown rate and 1.02 EPA on throws of 20 plus yards. And that compares to a best in the league negative 0.164 EPA versus the run. Mike Williams and Keenan Allen are live to have a ceiling game in this situation. And maybe Justin Herbert can crack 30 fantasy points for the first time this year, particularly with Tennessee giving up 81% of their touchdowns and 77% of their yardage through the air. Cincinnati can produce points and yards against anyone. But this game between them and Tampa Bay, it looks like one of the most unappealing games of the week. Tampa Bay forces punts at a league best 49% rate and a similarly impressive 28% 3-and-out rate. Meanwhile, Tom Brady, he struggles against everyone. He faces a Bengals D that allows a low 44% dropback success rate and a 59% completion rate overall, with both teams having implied totals of under 24 points. It feels like a game where the Bengals won't have to do much to steal away another win from a Bucs team that's dying to give them away. The Giants are heading to Washington for a hideous night of Sunday Night Football. And to me, it feels like a burial for an overachieving Giants team. The Commanders give up a low 41% success rate per play, and their negative 19% rushing DVOA should shut down an underperforming and overrated Saquon Barkley. Washington should be able to run to the Giants with them giving up a bottom of the league 11% DVOA boost to opposing rushers. The Giants stay in games thanks to a league high 41.5% blitz rate. But that's something that could create downfield opportunities for Terry McLaurin, as it did when I mentioned this 2 weeks ago when McLaurin went for 8 catches, 105 yards, and a touchdown in that tie versus the Giants. This seems like an ugly win for the Commanders, and I personally wouldn't expect ceiling games from anyone. The Rams are expected to start Baker Mayfield again on Monday Night Football at Green Bay. But this could be more of a Cam Akers and Kyron Williams spot as opposed to Baker's debut versus Vegas. Green Bay is bottom of the league with a 48% rushing success rate and a 12% rushing DVOA boost, as well as 5.2 adjusted line yards per rush and a league low 12% stuffed run rate. It's an ugly 16.3 implied total for the Rams, but leaning on the run game is one way they could pull off the upset at Green Bay. Going against the Rams D, that's an inverse situation for Green Bay. They're good versus the run with a negative 0.13 EPA, despite Aaron Donald likely to sit out the rest of the year. The Rams are very bad versus the pass with a 0.126 EPA and 49% success rate allowed on dropbacks. The Rams are also 31st versus wide receiver ones with a 27% DVOA boost to the position. Aaron Rodgers is disappointed in similar spots, but Christian Watson could be in for a sneaky upside day if he's given the ball aggressively. So if you found this video useful or interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to Splash Play. We have new videos daily, and each one is designed to make you smarter about what really matters in fantasy football. Follow me at Chris Spags and follow this show at Splash Play Pod. With all the chips on the line these next few weeks, from the bottom of my heart, I wish you good luck. I don't know how you guys feel, but you clicked on the video, so maybe you agree. I love this little question mark dude that's on the thumbnails now. He's so excited, so enthusiastic to talk about stats that matter. He is everything that I think we could all stand to be a little bit more these days.